Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Sean Maroney and I'm your host for International Focus's E-Talk, in which we get together for an hour once a week and entertain discussion about what's going on in the world and specifically the North Carolina region, the Triangle region. I want to welcome all of our guests tonight as well as new guests. This is our first episode where we've opened out participation to folks who are curious about International Focus and what we do as an organization and perhaps would like to join. We certainly hope that. International Focus, it builds on global understanding and respect by facilitating face-to-face diplomacy and professional, personal, and artistic exchange. So our mission is to promote mutual understanding between the people of North Carolina's Triangle region and the international community through education, cultural exchange, arts, and the celebration of achievements. I would like to thank Smoothie Island as our sponsor for this series of web talks that we've been doing for the past month. And for tonight's episode, Gene Scolati and John Toomey, two longtime members of International Focus, for their sponsorship of tonight's episode. And tonight, it is my privilege and welcome Jaki Shelton Green, the first African-American and third woman to be appointed as the North Carolina Poet Laureate. Jaki, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm really excited to talk with you about your work, how it highlights North Carolina as a region, but also just to pick your brain, because I feel as though, especially right now, we need to have some sort of wordsmith to really place out there what is happening in the news and all these different emotions that people must be feeling right now, whether it's COVID or whether it's what we're seeing in Minneapolis and in many other places around the country. So welcome tonight.
Thank you, and thank everyone for tuning in and for just bearing witness to being alive and embracing everything that's coming our way. That's the role of life. That's the role of us as human beings. And I also think back on Shelley's words that poets truly are the legislators of the world. And with that comes a lot of responsibility. As a poet laureate, I've been traveling all over the state since 2018 as an ambassador of the literary arts and expanding an appreciation of poetry and the literary arts across the country. What's most important to me is being in those neighborhoods where people's voices really are silenced, really are quiet, or often in public audiences who actually don't believe that they have voices. So I wanted to offer a short poetic meandering of sorts that I think is appropriate for us to think about how we hold space, how we're holding space for the beauty of being able to speak to each other right now without hindrance. We're alive, we're healthy. I pray everyone's families are healthy. But also how we bear witness to a virus that has truly taken our communities and our world hostage. And to think about what's happening right now, not only in Minneapolis, but in many places. I offer this as sort of an invocation. We cannot prevent the birds of sorrow from flying over our heads, but we can refuse to let them build nest in our hair. Who stops to record the whimpering of an ocean? I've seen you wrestling with the frozen tears of a moon. I know how you measure and weigh your own heartbeats with the stretching of olive branches. I've heard you scolding the wind for changing her name, her song. I listen to you scrape your crystallized tears from the roof of your own grave, from the hem of your mother's shroud. I have watched prayers crawl up your arms, dig into your heart. I've become blinded by all the light that lives there, all the light your hands are harvesting, all the love that we offer to each other each morning.
That's beautiful. your work, you tend to focus a lot on hands of people. Why do you do that? What's your focus on hands?
Wow, what's my focus on hands? I have a fetish for holding, carrying, bearing, sifting, raising, covering, shifting, blending.
You're a doer.
I'm a doer, yes. But the thing that's happening right now for me in the midst of this COVID-19 is understanding how much more of a being that I need to be. And I can't say everybody needs to be more of that, but I pray that we are doing more being than we are participating in all the things that name what we do. It's a time to be still. I really believe that. And I can actually, and maybe this is the poet in me, but I can actually hear the earth breathing, and I think about how metaphoric that is, that it is breath that we are struggling with through all of this. And yet the earth's lungs are wide open and she's breathing. So I think part of that is we've stopped doing so much of what we do that causes all of the problems of, pollution and ruining our ecosystem. And then there's the ecosystem of our humanity, which I'm very, very concerned with. So my poetry, for me, has always had to be a container. I think about the arts, creativity as a container for holding our joys, our sorrows, our disappointments, our regrets, celebrations. For me, my poetry is that container. So hands do loom large. I come from a family of potters. Like historic ancient potters, red clay, Orange County potters. We have lots of 1800 clay pots that an ancestor went to the branch, to the creek. She needed a pot for water, not for the aesthetic of making a fabulous pot with salt glaze, but she needed a pot. So she made one, to gather whatever we needed. So I come from a family whose hands I've seen the remnants, the evidence, the progeny of what their hands have yielded. My grandmother was a quilter. She did not make fabulous quilts because of the aesthetic of the art form of quilting. She made fabulous quilts because we needed to be warm. People needed to stay warm. And in New England mornings, when I was under my grandmother's quilts years ago, living in New England, I would often celebrate how she'd carried on, this legacy of using her hands. So yes, there are a lot of things, the hands, moon, womb, that are archetypes that loom large as metaphors in my work.
Do you find your muse to be rooted more in positive emotions or in a search for longing or sadness?
Well, I even think that sadness is a positive emotion because it is a valid emotion. It's an authentic emotion. And I remember growing up in a family where anger was an illegitimate emotion. As a child, I was not allowed to be angry. My brother would clobber me over the head with a toy. It would be, oh, don't be angry with your brother. He didn't really mean to do it. So anger was something that it took me years to realize it's a very valuable and legitimate emotion that in our culture we don't appreciate it so much. I think that when people understand that we truly are in charge of curating our own sensibilities and responses to, to things that happen in life, I think we get to deem, and let me give you an example. When I look at, I'm a documentarian and I'm a documentary poet. So I use a lot of secondary and primary objects and sources in reframing, in poetics. When I'm looking at a lynching, a photograph, a postcard of a lynching that happened in 1942 in Oklahoma, and there are people there celebrating, holding Coke bottles and Frankfurters and actually taking away body parts as souvenirs. And it is a gleeful, ecstatic moment. So in that frame, the question becomes, who is the narrator of what is, who gets to grieve in this picture and who's celebrating in this picture? So sometimes my joy might be someone else's grief, and my grief certainly might be someone else's joy. So everything informs my writing, not to be glib, but everything does inform my writing. So yes, I write from a historical lens of remembering to remember. But I also, in remembering to remember, we remember so that we might reinvent ourselves differently. So that when we are, reframing a historical moment, I always ask my students, what is the ending that you'd rather have? Let's write that ending into being. And how do we do that? It's how we live it into being. And I really believe that, that we're responsible for these narratives that we're weaving every day.
The saying has always been that history is written by the winners. And in your form of poetry, do you see this as a way to reclaim what might have been not the right side of history to win?
Well, I would like to think that I am giving voice to voices that may have been silenced in that historical moment and did not have the right to speak, voices that were muted. I'm reminded of coming across a document many, many years ago about Haitian slave women in the 1700s who were punished more regularly and more severely than their male counterparts. And they were punished frequently because they used the only weapon that was available to them. They used their tongues. They would not shut up. They just would not be quiet. And I thought about that even in the darkest of hours, we still have something that redeems us, and it's our voice. And, I've been to Brazil, and I've seen all of the historical women who were revolutionaries who were muted actually with, iron mask on their face. And that image has stuck with me, what it means to utter, the power of utterance. So for me, I would like to think that I am the utterance of so many women in a lineage that comes before me that may not have been able to tell a story, write their legacy, write their story. I would like to think that I am, there's this T-shirt now everybody's wearing. It says, I am my ancestors' greatest dream. I think that's what it says. And I'd like to think that my voice, that my writings, that the audacity sometimes to utter, it means something. And the more that we share our stories in this power of utterance, the more we share our stories and actually acknowledge that other matters, I think the more we will find ourselves over and over again inside of each other's stories. We will find our humanity that connects us. And that's the hope that I have. It's a dreary time. It's a frightening time as a woman of color. It's a frightening time as a woman of a black son, black stepson, grandsons, brothers. It's a scary time, but I also believe that there is hope, that there are people who don't look like me, who are picking up the universal story of what it means to be human and what it means to bear witness to the sorrow of other people, and understand that sorrow is also a stain upon all of our landscape. We share a landscape. There aren't 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 landscapes. There is one human landscape. And I'm foolish enough to believe that the more we have moments like this, the more that landscape, sort of starts to dwindle into a smaller landscape where we're actually standing in front of each other and not screaming across the aisle at each other. That's my dream. That's my hope.
What is the state of poetry and poets now in this landscape at this time in 2020? Are we moving forward or are we looking backwards?
Oh, I'm excited. It's a fabulous time when to be a poet. This morning or yesterday morning, I was just reading the lists of the Academy of American Poets, Poet Laureate fellowships. Last year, I was granted an Academy of American Poets fellowship. There are 11 of us. This year, there are 23. So, I was reading everybody's bio and their projects and was getting really excited. Poetry right now, because one, poets are redefining poetry and poetics. I did a residency at a university that I will not name a few years ago, and I was told by the person that I reported to that the only true poets were dead old Irishmen. And I was like, okay. So the good news is that there are so many fabulous voices emerging from everywhere. And I'm excited. There's poetry that bears witness to all of the cultural and societal and political issues that we're talking about. And inside of that is the beauty. There's a tremendous beauty inside of a lot of things that start out being tragedies or being challenges to our humanity. And I think it's the poet that can sift through that, and that's what we do. We play in the fire. We play in the broken glass. We find the names of the great grandfather, inside of a bottle that somebody threw into the creek, and it becomes a whole story. So, yeah.
I'm curious about your creative process, and I hope you indulge me in this, but when I was working in broadcast journalism, I had two very, very good mentors, one for radio and one for television. And independent of each other, they each taught me, the one in radio, whenever I was covering a story, to close my eyes and listen, and then remember that and capture that sound. And then when I would write my story, don't use your words to describe it, use the sound to paint the picture. And likewise, my mentor in television would say, pretend the TV's on mute. And if you can still understand what the story is about, then you did your job. As a poet, how do you approach the spark of creativity to tell a story?
Very much the same. It's interesting you said that, because one of my assignments at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke to my students is listening to an audio of a documentary poet with the sound off. And it's a video, so there are lots of images. Sound off, sound on. My process is very visceral and very organic. I'm a gatherer. I'm a collector, just like, we were talking about hands. I tend to, I like the texture of words. I like the texture of how things feel in my mouth when I'm saying them. Sometimes when I'm writing a poem, I'm looking for a word that sounds spicier or juicier or sharper or dull or a more naked word.
Is it how it sounds, or is it its connotation?
It's a lot about how it sounds. I have a background as a dancer, so when I'm writing, my process is a lot like choreography. I'm kind of constructing where lines are going. I actually, when I'm writing a poem, I am the choreographer most of the time. It's after I've created the poem that I go back and look at it and did I just write that? What's that? And then the choreographer shows up and starts rearranging and saying, well, no, you're 2 steps ahead. You shouldn't breathe there. That's a pause. That's the end of a sentence. So between being a choreographer, and this one will probably get you, I also think that for me, poetic construction is a lot like being an interior decorator. Mm. So some people, buy the rug and then they go find the couch for the rug. Right. Or they have that painting and they have to go find the painting for the couch.
We're building around this one thing.
Yeah. Exactly. So I'm very much into the construction of moving things around. I'm a collector. So I will collect 40 lines and let them sit there and then look at them the way I sit in my living room. And this actually happens. My husband and I are watching a movie, and I'm looking across the way, and I'm like, could you put that on pause? And I'll go up and take a photograph off the wall and take it to another place in the house and come back with another painting and put it on the wall and bring a plant back. And he was like, are we done now? And I'm like, well, yes, that photograph actually told me that she no longer wanted to be in this place. So I kind of pay attention to everything that way, the way I cook, the way I create a home, the way I put things together. There has to be some alchemy. I'm kind of like an alchemist, or, there has to be that energy and that synergy that's making the conversation happen at the same time.
And when do you decide you're done? Because an artist is never fully done. They just run out of time.
Oh gosh, that's a hard one, because some poems, they're done. I know they're done. I read them 20 times and I really want to move it around. And it's like, there's a voice that says, it's okay.
Don't mess with it. Yeah.
And then there are the poems. There are a few poems that I've actually edited 13 or 14 times. There was a poem going into one of my books, and I didn't like the poem, and I kept writing to my publisher saying, I need to work on that poem. And she says, you have 48 hours. Then it was 24 hours. And she called me at 9:00 and she said, if I don't have it by the time I wake up in the morning, that poem will not be in the book. And I was like, no, but it has to be in the book. She says, but she kept telling me the poem is perfect. And I kept saying, no, it's not right. So I sat, and at about 4:00 in the morning, I saw what it was. And it was out of order. The lines were out of order. And I'm an economist of language. I don't like a lot. So it's weird. People who know my work would say, really? Because I do write lengthy work. Mm-hmm. But I'm an economist of language. So I'm always deleting and looking at where am I being redundant, and, do I really need to put that there? But anyway, at 4:00 in the morning, it was right. It was about symmetry. It was about where it was located on the page that was throwing me off. And when I read it, there was the flow. The choreographer in me saw the right current, saw it the way. When I was reading it before, I just kept getting stuck in the mud. So I am a strong believer in revision. And I've become a pretty good editor of my own work and other people's work.
That's hard, to be your own editor.
It's taken me many, many, many years, but I've had two amazing editors. I've had amazing editors. And one editor my last publication, there was a poem he didn't like. And I said, is it the content of the poem? And he said, no, I love the content of the poem. He said, it's something about this poem. I just don't like it. And we kept playing around with the poem. He would send me a revision. I didn't like it. He didn't like mine. So he showed up at my house the next morning. We went downtown, sat in a coffee shop, like from about 9:00 and it's about 2:30, 3:00. And we were going back and forth revising the poem. And we handed each other our computers, and we'd written the same thing. And we just high-fived each other. And it was like, we both saw it at the same time. Again, it was about placement. It was just about placement. And I pay attention to great editors, and I follow their leads. I appreciate editors. The only time I've ever really pushed back with an editor is when my New York editor, she's not a New York editor as a New York editor living in New York, but because she's from New York and lives in the South, there was a colloquial term that she did not understand. And she kept telling me the word didn't exist. And I said, well, oh yeah, it exists.
Do you remember what it was?
I can't remember now, but I do remember now. It was a slang for a river. It was the slang colloquial name for a river in South Carolina. And I knew what these people called that river. And she kept saying, this is a misspelled word. And I'm like, no, it's a real river. So finally, I don't know, I found some document or something, and I sent it to her and I said, it's a river, and I'm keeping the word. So sometimes colloquialism will get me in trouble with my editors. When I intentionally want to stray away from standard English and use a word that's in patois or Arabic or, some other language, or in Creole or something in dialect. So sometimes I get in trouble like, well, I don't know what that says. It's like, but I do. And there will be readers who do. I'm
glad you mentioned the other languages, because I want to ask you, your travels are so fascinating to me because you've done work in Brazil, you've done work in Morocco. What I found as I majored in Spanish in college in addition to journalism, and I found that when you would read poetry in the native tongue and then read a translation, it doesn't connect. So much is missing. So I'm wondering, when you go to these other countries and either you're teaching workshops or just appreciating what you find there, how do you bridge that divide of language and connotation and colloquialisms?
Well, it's difficult. It's challenging, but the first time I went to Brazil, I was there. I was selected as two American writers were selected to come to Brazil for some huge cultural carnival that focused around African-American heroes. Rosa Parks, just a litany of famous people, MLK. And we were invited as two African-American writers to come and participate in this festival. When the Brazilian interpreters started translating my work into Portuguese, one of the poems was about my grandmother, who was a missionary. There was a line in there about first Monday night missionary circle. And there was no connotation. He said, what is this? And I said, well, my grandmother was a missionary and she would hold the missionary meeting at her house every Monday night, and there was food and the women had an agenda. They raised money. At the time, my grandmother and her missionary groups, they actually were raising money for irrigation systems in Liberia and orchards in Liberia. That's when I was a child. Those orchards are full grown now, and we have documentation about it. But I kept running into, there were just no words to translate. My publication, I Want to Undie You, which is a book about my 38-year-old, my daughter who died at 38 years old, 11 years ago. It was recently translated into Italian by a friend of mine who is Moroccan Italian. And, we spent a lot of time on the telephone. And when I was in Morocco with him working on the syntax of the book, because he was like, I don't know. There's
it's a weighty book.
Yeah, there's no Italian word for certain words. So what I have learned is to trust the spirit of my poetry and to trust that the emotionality of it is seamless, that it has a universal language. And I'll give you an example of that was really humbling for me and empowering for me. In 2017, I was in Morocco keynoting an international prose poetry symposium. I read a poem that I had written about police brutality. It was actually written for a project called Poetry of Lamentation. So this was the year of the many, weekly murders that we were seeing on TV. And a woman in New York reached out to poets all over the world and said, I want to do an anthology, an online anthology called Poetry of Lamentation, to bear witness to what's happening. And we want families across the United States to know they're not alone, that we're holding the space with them. So she calls me, and the instructions were that if you agreed to participate in this project, that you should check your email within 24 hours, because within 48 hours, you would have your person and that you would write about. So I said, okay. And then I hung up and I realized I'm waiting on somebody to die to write a poem about them. And I was very affected and felt really weird about doing this. But I got my person, and my person did not have a name. Within 36 hours, I had my person, and it was a link to a literally less than 30-second soundbite that says, unidentified African-American male shot dead on Route 13 in some place I never heard of, Michigan. More details on 6 o'clock news. That was it. That's all I had. And I read the poem I wrote for this person, this young man, when I was in Morocco. I read it one night. The next morning, I bumped into an older man who said, it's you. And I said, what do you mean it's me? He said, you're the one that read that poem last night. And I said, which one? And he said, the one about the young man who was murdered. And I said, yes. He said, well, I must tell you something. He said, I was sitting with a group of old men. And I recognized this man. I knew he was a famous Amazigh scholar in Persian poetry. I knew who he was. I was kind of weirded out that he even spoke to me.
You're starstruck.
Yeah, he said, I was sitting with all these elders. He said, they were weeping. He said, they were just weeping. He said, they speak no English. He said, they kept saying to me in Arabic, what is she saying? Why are we weeping? What's wrong with me? And he said, we were all sitting there weeping. He said, I was translating, trying to whisper and translate as much as I could to them. And he said, they were just weeping. You know, men with long beards and long thobes with prayer beads and they said to him, this is what poetry is about. When you don't know the language and you can evoke that quality of sorrow for someone who has never met you and does not even know what you're talking about. And I remember it was very humbling. I felt like it was a tremendous compliment. But I really had to sink into, and sit with what he just said. And I could see those men, and I would see them the entire time I was there, and they would always kind of bow to me and, and say things to me in Arabic that I did not understand. But yeah, I would like to think, and that happens to me often when I'm with people. I remember being in Switzerland once. I had gotten mad at a boyfriend and stolen his car and took off with the keys and his wallet, and I didn't know where I was going, flying to the Swiss Italian Alps. And I went around a curve and I thought I saw something move, and I turned around and I came back. And there are these little women sitting on the side of the road. They were selling truffles, very expensive truffles that only they knew where they were. These steep mountains, they had flat little leather shoes, and they would scale these cliffs to get these truffles and come back down and sell them on the side of the mountain. Well, they're talking. I have on a kerchief. They all have on scarves, and they just keep patting their heads. They were patting my head, and they were patting their heads, and they were patting my head. And, they were talking a mile a minute. They are all putting their baskets in my car, and they're telling me to drive. And, and they're telling me where to go. Long story short, they kidnapped me. They were a band of gypsies. And
goodness.
It was the scarf. It was the symbol. And I had no idea what I was saying to them for 4 days that I'd stayed with them. They were trying to marry me off to every single guy in the village. But in that moment, I realized that it was the language of this kindredness of a piece of cloth, that I had on a scarf. But they actually kidnapped me. And There's a young boy in the village who could speak English, and he said, they think you're a saint. They don't think you're real. They've never seen a Black person ever. He said, I've only seen a Black person on TV. He said, but these grannies have never seen a person like you. And they are just like, they don't know what you are. But, that no language thing has never been a barrier for me. I've always managed in other countries to communicate, and especially with women and children. Long answer to a short question, but but in terms of my poetry, I've just allowed it to show up on page, and I work with a lot of translators, and somehow they muddle through, and they find the word that will make sense to an Italian reader. It's all about context. So.
I'm curious, hearing about your experience in Switzerland and knowing from our previous discussions about your experience here within your home state. Explain to the audience how different you feel when you're at home traveling the state than when you were greeted like that in Switzerland.
Well, North Carolina is very interesting, as we all know. There are 100 counties, and I am being invited into all of those 100 counties. The Poet Laureateship, I am not told where to go. I'm invited into places. I don't decide that I'm reading at a library in Wake County next week. I'm only going places where I'm invited. So it's been interesting that I'm being invited all over the state, which is wonderful. And sometimes I'm like, how do they know about me? Because I'm going to places that I've never heard of. I'm going to counties that I'm embarrassed to say I've never heard of those counties before. Like the county stuck in between two other counties. Mm-hmm. I was going somewhere. It didn't happen. It was canceled, where they told me there were 4,000 people in the entire county, and that where I was staying, there would be no Wi-Fi. There would be no food, that I needed to bring my own food. There were 2 restaurants. There was a breakfast restaurant, but it closed at noon. And there were no evening restaurants. So you have to bring your food with you. So there is that part of just, understanding the geography being so different than what I'm used to in the Triangle. But what's really interesting is poet laureating as the first African-American woman. Or maybe the first African-American person. There have been many, many instances that have not felt comfortable, that have not been pleasant. And what I have allowed inside of those moments is for people to be who they need to be, and for people to own their own truths. I was attacked and a part of our state at a conference. This conference asked me to do a workshop of my choice, and I wrote to them and said, okay, well, let's do a documentary writing workshop. Let's not just do something about craft. They were very excited about it. The title of the workshop was The Writer as Researcher, Historian, Documentarian, and Activist and Agitator. So if you signed up for that workshop, you kind of knew what you were getting yourself into. We start with a video that I use at Duke, and I use in a lot of my workshops. It's an art video. It's fabulous. People love it. But it's heavy. When it's over, there's a moment of silence. I just let people sit with it. And they're like, wow, this is going to be interesting to use as a prompt. This woman started screaming at me. I mean, she was screaming. And it took me a moment to realize she was screaming at me. And just saying all kind of inappropriate racial things to me. And the room was just going ballistic. All the women in the room were screaming at her to be quiet, to shut up. Why was she attacking me? Yada, 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 yada. And I just sat there. I just stood there looking at her because I didn't know what was happening. And finally, I I was worried about her because she was screaming so loud that the veins in her head were bulging. And I was really concerned that she was going to have a stroke. So I just said, excuse me, may I say something? Can I just interject for 1 second? And she let me like inside of the space. And I said, first of all, I want to thank you for speaking your truth. I said, even though it's apparent that nobody else in the room is sharing whatever it is you're feeling right now, I said, but that's besides the point. I encourage people to speak their truth. Thank you for speaking your truth. You have my permission to speak your truth. What you don't have my permission to do is disrupt the workshop. I said, right now, I'm very, very concerned about your physical well-being, your emotional state. Please take some deep breaths. I'd suggest that you might want to just step out of the room get yourself together. I'm not sure what triggered you. We can talk about it, but I think it would be good to just if you can just calm down, take a deep breath. We can, I'll listen to you. And I shut up. Well, she started screaming at me again. You don't tell me what to do. Who do you think you are? I'm not leaving. And it was just, it was just horrible. People like you, the world is screwed up because of Black people like you. We're not racist. It's Black people who are racist. And it was just like this nonsensical, and I realized there was something really wrong, that there was something going on, that the whole scenario just made no sense. So her poor husband was trying to literally drag her out of the room. And she was coming closer and closer to me as if she was going to lurch, actually attack me, which would have been really bad because all of the other white women in the room were on attack mode. So I'm kind of like the little kid who's like going, this is really interesting. The husband drags her out of the room. People are just going nuts. And I use humor because that's all I knew to do in that moment. I just said, okay, this is your pilot speaking. Your pilot has recaptured control of the cockpit. All is well. Drinks will be served momentarily. I need everyone to return to your seats. Please reach for your airbag if necessary. Everybody take a deep breath. We just hit a little turbulence, but we're sailing smooth now. And then I said, okay, we can't pretend this just didn't happen. But I came here to facilitate a workshop. I'd like to do this. You have 20 minutes for us to debrief, process, break this down. A woman raises her hand and she said, so, do you do this often using a plant? And she thought it was all a part of the class. And I said, well, I don't know the woman. This was not a part of my workshop. And I'm telling this story because it could have gone really, really bad. I did not feel like I needed to do, one, defend myself, two, react to her, be defensive towards her. And everybody in the room was like, how could you stand there and be so cool, calm, and collected and not be bothered? And my response was, because this is not my narrative. That was her narrative. That was her story. That was her stage. I don't need to walk on every stage in my vicinity. Yes, this is in my physicality right now, but that's not my stage, and it's not my place to tell her who she needs to be. And what was really happening is all the other people in the room were all embarrassed, and they were screaming, we're so sorry. This is not who we are as a community. We don't know that woman. We're all different. And I had to remind them, no, she is your community. Because guess where she's going? She's going home. I guess who she lives next to and who her friends are, people who think like her. So yes, she is a part of your community and my community. But we can't isolate her voice. We can't disenfranchise her voice any more than I say, I will not allow you to disenfranchise my voice. And I said, I can't go check on her. But as a community, you all need to go check on her. When I leave, you all need to go see if she's okay. You need to go see if her husband's okay. That's what community building looks like. And yeah, you got to own this is a part of your story too. So there's that story. The story that I'm most happy to report. Last year, Biscuitville decided they wanted to celebrate me for Black History Month. So I hope everybody knows what Biscuitville is. Biscuitville sells biscuits. It's a franchise on North Carolina, Virginia. So I thought it was a hoot, to get an email from Biscuitville. And they apparently have this big promotion where every Black History Month they celebrate not a North Carolinian, but a famous African-American historical figure. So the letter from the publicist was really sweet and funny. She said, we've been doing this for a few years. We really always celebrate dead old Black people. And she went, oh, well, but you're very much alive and you just made history. And we really want to put you on the bookmark. And I was like, okay. So lo and behold, they invite me to do a poetry reading at 8:00 in the morning on a Monday morning at a Biscuitville in Greensboro. And I go, and the place is just packed, as in you can't find a parking space. There are like 4 TV camera trucks, and I'm thinking, these trucks aren't here for me. And I go in, and I'm like, I'm a real rock star at Biscuitville. And it's a big deal. And
that's how you know you've made it in North Carolina.
Right. There's a receiving line, and all of the workers are dressed up in their white starched uniforms, and the head biscuit chef, he's standing there. And it was beautiful. It was really sweet. And they called me and they said, oh, that went fabulous. We'd like for you to do this next Monday, same place, same time.
Wow.
And I'd like to invite the local historically Black college's poet laureate to come be with you. The two of you can do a poetry reading. I was like, sure, that would be great. So we go, we do the poetry reading. Halfway through the reading, I noticed 4 men come in. They're wearing the red hats, Make America Great Again hats. They come in, they get their food, they take a booth, and I'm sort of watching them out of the corner of my eye. And one guy picks up the bookmark, and he looks at the bookmark, and he turns around and he looks at me. So this guy shows the bookmark to the other 3 men, and they're all looking at the bookmark, and they're all looking at me. Then they're looking at the bookmark, and they're looking at me. Fast forward, the program is over. People are leaving. I'm standing by the door saying goodbyes to people. And the 4 guys walk up to me. And the first guy says, is this you? And I went, yep. And he said, well, that's pretty cool. And I went, yeah, that's kind of cool, isn't it? Second guy says, well, where are you from? And I'm thinking, dude, I'm not telling you where I'm from. And I say, oh, I'm just a little old country girl. And the first guy says, oh, just like us. And I say, yeah, just like us. So the first guy's talking a lot. He says, wow. He says, I really love it when really good things happen to ordinary people like us. I said, isn't that fabulous when good things happen to ordinary people just like us? So the third guy says to me, well, nobody's going to believe. No, the third guy pulls out a stack of the Biscuitville coupons. He has like a whole stack of them. And he says, I'm taking these to my kids' Black History Month program. And I'm thinking, this is so bizarre. And I was like, well, that's really cool. That's great. And the same guy says, nobody's going to believe we met the poet laureate at Biscuitville. And the first guy says, I know. He says, my wife is going to be so upset and so jealous. So the guy who hasn't spoken says, well, they will believe us if she will take a selfie with us. So I'm thinking, take a selfie. So I said, okay, sure. I take the selfie. But before I take the selfie, the 4 guys almost in unison take off their hats and throw them on the seat behind us and embrace me. And we take a picture. They all hug me and they leave. And they're still talking They're like four little boys. They're still talking like, wow, that was so cool. We met the poet laureate of North Carolina. And my brain is like, wow, how interesting. At this point, I am being confronted by the young African-American women from this Black college. And they are saying to me, how could you do that? Why would you talk to them? Why on earth would you take a picture with those men? Did you see their hats? And my response to them was, I saw their hats. I said, since you observed the entire thing, then there are a couple of things going on here. Since you observed the entire thing, then one, you know that I did not approach them, number one. Number two, they came to me in a really wonderful, affirming energy, very positive. I said, I've been around the block. I know when I'm being kind of conned. I said, they were genuine. What you just happened is me walking my talk. If I believe that we have to have enough courage to step outside of our boundaries, to know each other, that's what I just did. That's what they just did. It was not prompted. It was not required, but it happened. So when you're writing those hashtags, solidarity and all of those hashtags, are they just hashtags or how do we stand up inside of them? So it was a moment for me, and I say that this is one of the things that I celebrate most, was to have those young people be observant in a room and to finally, I think they finally got what I was trying to say, that you cannot be peacemakers in a vacuum, that it takes both sides. So do I think that I changed the values, the opinions, the politics of those gentlemen? Of course not. But that's not my business. Their hats are not my business. Their humanity is my business, to be respectful.
That's such an amazing story. And thank you for sharing that with all of us. I believe we have our biggest audience that we've ever had since we started these discussions. So I just wanted to say welcome to everyone for this first e-talk for International Focus. Our guest tonight is Jaki Shelton Green, North Carolina's Poet Laureate. Normally at about 4:30, I would tell everyone in the audience to start sending me questions to ask our guests. But unfortunately, I was so engrossed in our conversation, I had to send a written message over the chat. But I would like to ask folks in the audience if they have a question for North Carolina's Poet Laureate to please submit. Kalisa, she sent a question, and she would love to know your response to the recent killing of George Floyd and what she believes, or what you believe, the responsibility of the poet is during this time. It's you write a lot and you speak a lot of creating in the silence and taking moments. But how does one do that in such a cacophony of terrible actions and screaming? Well,
I think if we are being truth tellers and documenting all of our life's experiences, I think one that I'm doing that every day. I'm doing that every day. Every day someone is dying, whether we know about it or not. I think right now more than ever, we have to be a loud voice for so many voices that are being marginalized, erased, intentionally silenced. And it comes with risk. It comes with risk. But my job is to tell. That's all. My job, the poet's voice, is to document, for me, to document and to tell. And to hold, coming back to poetry being a powerful container of experience, and we can come back to that container. So there has to be documentation, and there will be. I mean, it's no different than a death that happened 2 or 3 years ago. We documented that death too, So we must speak, we must write on every landscape and every venue that's available to us to speak, to speak truth, and to open the door. I think sometimes it's the role of the artist to open the door for people who are afraid. People want to talk, but they don't know from whence to enter into the conversation. For the past year, I have been facilitating a project with Quail Ridge Books in Raleigh, entitled Reading James Baldwin for a Year. And the very first session, there were over 200 people that showed up, it just blew our minds. And what I learned from that session, that people are very hungry and eager to talk about things that are unsettling, in our world, in our communities, in our state, in our country. And it was a beautiful thing to see all of these people of different ages, different backgrounds, different, class stratas, people who were very interested in being the change and speaking the change. And what came out of that were women, older Black and older white women, who started hanging out for coffee together from this session, and were having their own little kind of sub discussions about the books and then coming back to the larger group. There was a lot of community building going on, and that's my role. And inside of every instance like this, I have facilitated gatherings in our home around food, with people who are feeling wounded, people who are terrified. One of my neighbors called me when Trayvon Martin was murdered and said that her 9-year-old told her that he'd figured out how to keep himself and all of his African-American playmates safe. And he told his mom, so I figured this out. All of you are very smart women and men, our parents. You can homeschool all of us. We don't have to ever leave the house. We can play games. We can talk by video, and we'll just stay in the house forever. And she called me weeping. She came to the house weeping because this is a 9-year-old who was serious about just ending his life by staying inside. And she said, what do I tell him? So we have a great role here as makers, as artists, as creative beings, to help people lift up things that are hard to carry. Violence is hard to carry. When people see people looting on TV, it's hard to carry. And I always say, do you understand the difference between a riot, and this is a response. This is an act. This is an act of resistance. And yes, there may be things that look strange to you, but I'm not sure what a lot of people would do in the same instance. So I think for us as artists, we have a responsibility. If this makes sense to the question, we have a big responsibility, and we have the tools. We have all the tools that we need to help people reimagine how to step inside of this discussion.
I think you give some really interesting guidance for all of us who are stuck in our homes, on how to be creative and how to make human connections, even when we physically can't. I think your words are very powerful in that regard. And an interesting question that was sent as a segue, basically, from Marn Patana: what advice would you give schools and students and teachers on how to create a safe and inclusive environment, sort of to foster the creativity that you exhibit in your daily life and you encourage in all of our lives, especially from home?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that collectively, we're really undergoing a very permanent shift in our national consciousness in terms of reconstructing how we're going to become, what we're going to become after this. I think we're all reimagining different ways of being in terms of values and symbols and how we show up. First of all, and I'm going to say this, I think that there has to be some re-education in the public school system and the private school system, not to leave out private schools. There has to be some retooling of what do teachers need. I witness a lot of racism, classism, sexism, homophobia inside classrooms, inside school systems. So first of all, I think you have to have teachers, all teachers that are willing to be really there as the gatekeepers for all children's humanity. And to understand that, yes, the child sitting next to child A may process very differently than child B. And child C may not be processing at all because that child has not eaten all night or was up all night, worried to death about something none of us know about. And I think it's a time where I've been calling this a righteous pause. We're inside of this righteous pause where I think we all can re-examine who we are and what are we bringing that's different, that's fresher, that's healthier when we reemerge. It's a time for all of us to do some cleansing and to ask ourselves, what are the tools that I need to be even better? I just feel like the universe has given us this moment to get it right. And I don't mean like to get it right in a very, kind of fantasy mode, or trivial mode, but to really think about how we can reimagine how we go back into our classrooms. Maybe we go back standing up a little bit straighter and not being afraid to teach a unit that we've always wanted to teach as a teacher.
Righteous pause.
That makes sense.
The silence of the moment provides for more introspection so that maybe we can recognize where there's been dissonance and that's where we can move forward too. Mm-hmm. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for all the questions that everyone sent. As we come to a close with this, our first e-talk, Jaki, I want to wish you an early happy birthday, and I know it's going to be a special one. So why don't you tell everyone what you have planned for this year's birthday for you next month?
Sweet. So my birthday is Juneteenth, and it will also be the celebration of my second year as the Poet Laureate. The governor called me on my birthday in 2018 to inform me he'd appointed me as the Poet Laureate of North Carolina. This year on my birthday, the release of my vinyl album.
Vinyl, I like it.
Yes, I have a vinyl LP that's going to drop, as well as a CD. We had to do some CDs, but yeah, we vinyl, and I'm happy to report that there's some great people on it with me: Charlotte Ammons and Nina Freelon, C.J. Seward, who's the Poet Laureate of Chapel Hill, and a good friend of mine, Jennifer Evans, who's an amazing vocalist. We're really proud of it, and we're very excited about it. And of course, there were tons of launch parties and a lot of travel involved, but I guess we might do a Zoom party, a boring Zoom party.
It doesn't have to be boring.
I don't know. I'm trying to think, what do you do with an album? Just play it and let people listen. I don't know. But my PR people will figure that out. So that's what's happening on Juneteenth. Thank you for the birthday wishes. And I hope you all will, be curious enough to check it out. It's entitled...
How can we find it?
Yeah, so it's entitled... Oh, my God. The River Speaks of Thirst. For a moment, I just went totally blank. The title...
We've been discussing some weighty issues, and it's late on Friday after quite a busy short week.
I can't believe that I can't tell my producer. He will kill me. The River Speaks of Thirst by Clearly Records. And if you go to JakiSheltonGreen.com, there will be some pre-order. I think they're going to drop some pre-order information like next week. Find me on Facebook. It'll be all over the place.
I've heard you read, I've heard online you recite that poem, and if it's any indication of how the rest of the album is, it's absolutely amazing and very powerful. And just the way you weave in nature and the words that you choose, and also just the joy of hearing you read it, I highly recommend. So I hope everyone out there seeks it out and plays it either at home or when they're out and about, and appreciates the silence and how you color the silence with your words.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much.
Well, Jaki Shelton Green, North Carolina's Poet Laureate, thank you for joining us for International Focus's first e-talk. I think this was fantastic because I think it shows why, as North Carolinians, we really celebrate North Carolina, and you are an example of the front-facing diplomacy that we put out there when we have international guests in our homes as part of International Focus. So thank you for joining us. I want to say a special thank you to Secretary of State Elaine Marshall. She joined us this evening as well. And for all of our International Focus members, board members, and their friends. This was the first time that we've opened this up to people who aren't International Focus members. So I highly encourage all of you to go to internationalfocusnc.org and look into membership, maybe look into hosting, visiting families, visiting guests from international countries here, and definitely go online and search for Jaki's upcoming album and pre-order. So, Jaki, thank you. Thanks to all of our friends. My name's Sean Maroney. Have a great weekend, everyone, and I hope to see you back here next Friday.
Thank you so much.